next. Let's begin this hour with President Trump, who has ordered the expulsion of 60 Russian intelligence officers and the closure of the Russian consulate in Seattle. Now, this is in latest response to last month's attack on a former Russian spy in England by a nerve agent.
Today, the president of the European Council said 14 EU member states have also decided to expel Russian diplomats. He went on to say, quote, additional measures, including further expulsions, are not excluded in coming days and weeks. Russia continues to deny its involvement in the attack.
CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata is tracking the latest developments from London, and he joins us now. So, Charlie, today President Trump, as we said, ordered the expulsion of these Russian agents. Walk us through this decision.
Well, you know, this is the day that Britain's problem with Russia became Britain's allies' problem with Russia, most importantly, the United States. So when President Trump and others decided to expel 48 Russian diplomats, another 12, I think, from the UN, it was matched in kind here in Europe. It's a good day for British Prime Minister Theresa May. Just to give you the numbers, because this is what it's all about. Denmark expels 2, France 4, Germany 4, Ukraine, not part of the EU, 13, Lithuania 3, the Czech Republic 3, Poland 4, Netherlands 2, Estonia 1, Italy 2. That's the crib sheet for you. Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, no stranger to hyperbole, says today's extraordinary international response by our allies stands in history as the largest collective expulsion of Russian intelligence officers ever. Now we wait for the Russian response to that. But this is the day that the EU, European partners, especially the United States, got on board to what was essentially a problem with Britain and Russia, a bilateral issue has now become an issue that poses Russia against the West, Britain and its allies.
So in terms of a response, we have heard from the Russian embassy in the U.S., perhaps speaking in the language the president understands. They took to Twitter asking followers to vote on which U.S. embassy in Russia they should close. If it was up to them. It's an interesting way to respond to this sort of, So have we heard anything further from the Kremlin besides this tweet?
Not yet, but what we have heard from Moscow, from the Kremlin, is they always quote this, the principle of reciprocity. And that is when there has been an expulsion in the United States, as happened in 2016 when President Obama expelled 35 what he called intelligence operatives. That's always the language that they use when they throw out diplomats who are suspected of maybe overstretching their diplomatic reach. Russia had responded in kind, ordering the expulsion of, well, hundreds of diplomats, Americans and others that were involved. So I think we can expect, you know, possibly the same sort of numbers of Americans that will be expelled. What makes this more interesting is, are they going to respond in kind to the rest of the British allies that have now piled in here? Are we going to see a mass expulsion that goes across the board from Denmark to Italy? Well, they don't need much of an excuse to expel Ukrainian diplomats. But for the rest of them, that will be the question. And I think the real question here is President Putin even going to draw a breath about this? Is this going to have any impact at home? It can't go unanswered, but whether this is going to have an impact in terms of the diplomatic ties and a cooling of relationships. And as you had already mentioned, that the EU has already said that there are other measures that they would consider, which, of course, includes the expulsion of even more diplomats. At some point, this is going to have an impact on the daily business and relationship between the United States and Russia, for that matter, but Britain and Russia, and Britain and the rest of these countries who are now piling in defense and in support of the UK.
I think, Charlie, that's the great question. You just hit the nail on the head. Expelling diplomats, war of words on Twitter, on social media, even the United States press and the foreign press focusing on whether or not Russia meddled in American elections in 2016 and other elections across the West. Not a big deal, but when that oil stops flowing or when economic interests take a hit, that's when we'll, I think, see some kind of serious movement.
Sure, that's when you do, when you hit President Putin and his own allies, official and otherwise, in their wallets. That has yet to, those decisions have yet to be made here, even in the UK, as a matter of fact. They had mentioned that there'd be a freezing of assets, but only when it comes to Russians or Russian state that may have been involved to the detriment of British citizens. So not this sort of across-the-board sanctions. And we haven't seen that, and we don't expect to see that in Europe. But it will be a chilling of the relationship. Now, what this means in real terms, whether this has an impact on President Putin's power, which is really all that matters in Moscow and Russia and the relationships in dealing with Russia, that remains to be seen, partly because it will take analysts who know more than I do as to whether this is something that simply got out of control, that this poisoning of the Russian spy, Sergei Skripal, 3 weeks ago was badly handled, who ordered it, whether this came from the top, whether President Putin was involved, whether the Kremlin was involved, who can be held responsible. And then once you start boiling that down, what measures, what serious measures you can take in order to undermine President Putin. I mean, expelling 14 diplomats from Europe, 23 from the UK, 60 from the United States. Is it really going to have that much of an impact in the dealings between the United States, Russia, and Europe in Russia?
Yeah. I think London will still be Londonistan, if that's how you say it, Charlie.
It's called that for a reason.
Yeah, exactly right. Charlie reporting from London. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.